speaking about how the method of Lectio Divina develops a personal relationship with God and specifically with Jesus Christ. And now we have moved through that development to the fourth stage of Lectio, the stage of resting in God, at which point this centering prayer method is a way of developing this fourth stage, which in our Christian tradition we call contemplation or resting in God. I'd like to point out that the use of a sacred word in order to calm the mind and the emotions is simply a way of penetrating the hard shell of the false self system, the superficial psychological self, by deliberately fouling up, so to speak, its normal way of thinking for a specific period of time as a discipline for spreading out the boats, that is to say, the incessant movement of thoughts, impressions, sense, mental or spiritual, across the inner screen of consciousness. So we're trying to spread out the speed at which they come down, and ideally to reduce all those thoughts to one. Wouldn't that be wonderful? If we could reduce all our thoughts to one, then prayer would be delightful, because then we could turn our attention without the stimulation of being drawn out of spiritual attentiveness all the time towards the presence of God in our inmost being, in pure faith, beyond concepts, beyond feelings, beyond particular acts, except a general loving look or attention, the attention of listening. Okay. The sacred word has two purposes. It's designed to dissolve all the other thoughts, impressions, perceptions, which it doesn't do very well. And at the same time, it's designed to be an affirmation of our original intention with which we begin each period of centering prayer, to open ourselves and to surrender ourselves to the mystery of God's presence within us. I say mystery because there is no concept of God to hang on to in this particular prayer. It's not something we do all day long, but it's a discipline to get beyond our over-dependency on thinking, reflecting, analyzing to go to God, and our over-dependency on feeling things about God. Hopped up, in other words, our dependency on some emotional stimulation in order to maintain our attention towards this mystery within us. So the sacred word then is a little boat, so to speak, a thought that we float in our imagination, where the other psychological boats and debris and whatever is coming down the stream is perceiving. The sacred word is somewhat like the video game called Pac-Man. Perhaps you've seen Pac. Now, Pac-Man, if I understand it correctly, goes all over the stream gobbling up all the other little creatures if you're a successful player of that game. And so the sacred word has the same general purpose, to dissolve all the other thoughts, to gobble them all up and reduce them to itself. Now, it must be admitted it doesn't do this as well as Pac-Man does if you're playing the game well. But it just gives you a general idea, by analogy, of the purpose of this sacred word. In other words, we float this particular thought not to think about it, but to let go, to use it as a means, a device for letting go of all the other thoughts, or at least spreading them out, so that we can give at least some of our attentiveness towards our spiritual nature and the God who dwells at its source. The sacred word has the secondary purpose of pointing to the depths. Now, as a pointer, it's simply an arrow, so that the content of the sacred word is really not that important. So whatever word you choose, as long as it's a short one, because it's easier to forget a short word than a sentence. That's the reason why the Cloud of Unknowing by the anonymous 14th century English mystic, one of the great sources of this teaching, suggests a word that is very short, that you can easily recall and which doesn't take up a lot of attention. So the sacred word could be something that is itself sacred, such as the holy name of Jesus, Abba, or Father, or peace, or the Spirit, trust, faith, love, or it could be something that sort of reminds you of the movement that's involved, such as quiet, stillness, silence. It really doesn't matter what word you choose as long as you feel comfortable with it and it symbolizes what you're trying to do. By that I mean it's only an arrow pointing where you want to go. So it doesn't matter whether the arrow is painted red, white, or blue. It's simply a pointer. And it's important to grasp this use of the sacred word, because in meditative practices, both in the Christian tradition and in other traditions, words or sentences or mantras, as the Hindu folks call it, have a much more specific and different purpose. The Hindu mantra has a vibratory effect because of the Sanskrit language that tends to calm the mind. And carefully chosen mantras have come down in their tradition and are available today. The Christian tradition also has similar sayings. I hesitate to call it a mantra because that would be confusing the traditions, but say the Jesus prayer developed in the Byzantine Eastern Orthodox tradition, and which has been made available and famous by the little book, The Way of the Pilgrim. And this is, the practice consists in saying this sentence over and over again: Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, this would be a marvelous practice together with the centering prayer outside the time of centering prayer. But the centering prayer is a specific method, and it has its own dynamic, and it has to be done according to that dynamic for its fruits to be fully realized and experienced. And it distinguishes itself from a mantra or the Jesus prayer or some other form of concentrative method, such as gazing upon an icon, another marvelous way of calming the mind and heart and connecting with the mystery of Christ in the Byzantine tradition. A very rich theological tradition which has preserved very well a connection between theology and spirituality, which the Western Church has done a less good job in doing over the centuries. In any case, this other methods, for instance, are concentrating on one's breathing. Another method is concentrating on one's position, which is characteristic of the Soto Zen school in Buddhism, in which one simply reaffirms one's posture again and again, but it's usually accompanied by breathing exercises as well. Now, the Zen practice is a be here now kind of practice that fixes one firmly in the environment in the present moment, and its purpose seems to be to integrate body and soul and spirit together with one's basic unity with all the rest of reality by means of the same gesture. A receptive method of contemplative prayer or concentration, which is what centering prayer is, withdraws the external senses from the current reality and the environment and from time and the time and space continuum. And for a fixed period of time, turns the attention inwardly, withdrawing it from the external senses. Not as an end in itself, but with the view of establishing unity between body, mind, and spirit, and then in active life, in ordinary life, gradually working the experience of that space into the whole of life with all its details. They're both going in the same direction, and the main difference is that one may be more suitable to one kind of temperament than another, and in our day, the concentrative method is very useful because of the very active minds that most people have in our time. The receptive method also presupposes a more profound trust in God. But since most concentrative methods eventually become receptive after they've developed, it's a way of beginning that places one firmly on the path to transcendence and to higher consciousness and to the opening of ourselves to pure faith in the presence of God as He is. And God presents Himself as He is only to pure faith, beyond concepts, beyond feelings, beyond the psychological life, although that presence sometimes radiates through that our other faculties. Basically, the deepest communication of God is totally unfelt. It's only when it reverberates or ricochets off the other faculties or overflows from a deep fountain within that one perceives it psychologically. This divine light is always shining, and the divine life is manifesting itself on the various levels of our life all the time, or we wouldn't be here. So we're moving. This is the river of life, really, that we are that constitutes the deepest source of our being. And this is, in the image I've been giving you, the river is our participation in the divine life as it wells up within us and sustains us in every level of our bodily, mental, and psychological and spiritual life. So it's important to keep that distinction in mind. All contemplative practices are not the same, and some of them that are especially receptive or especially concentrative have quite distinctly different psychological effects in the beginning. For instance, if one is doing a concentrative method in which you are working hard to maintain your posture, your breath, or to keep saying some kind of sacred word over and over and again in your mind, you're in a concentrative method and you're in control of the situation. Hence, the unconscious does not begin to unload right away. When you adopt a receptive method, such as the centering prayer is, one is letting go. One is resting in God, and one experiences such a deep relaxation and rest at times that the whole nervous system relaxes, the whole body relaxes, the musculature relaxes, and the junk of a lifetime, the emotional garbage or residue of traumatic experiences stored throughout the body, begins to loosen up. It's like moisture on hard pan or clay. Clay or hard pan is like concrete, but when the moisture comes down, then it softens up. Then you can pull up the weeds easily. And so in the human organism, there is a process of psychological evacuation, just as there is a bodily series of processes to evacuate material that is useless, harmful, etc. But the problem for the poor psyche is that if it gets so traumatized that ordinary rest and relaxation doesn't touch the stuff that's repressed in the unconscious unless you get an extraordinary deep level of rest. And as we saw from our little exposition of rest, we never get a deep rest until we stop thinking about ourselves for a few minutes, and with its agitations and emotional responses, upsets, anxieties, etc. In other words, our ordinary flow of thoughts reinforces the false self system, which maintains the repression of certain material and causes it to remain there as blocks, so to speak, in the general movement of energy throughout the body and the spirit, so that you experience various levels of unease or disease, which simply means a lack of the way things should be flowing. So to restore that balance, to restore health, we need to get rid of the junk that, as you saw in that diagram I had here a little while ago. The outer rim of our surface thoughts and our psychological consciousness is holding in place a slew of unconscious, repressed material that, until it is able to escape, covers over and prevents us from enjoying or reaching or touching or perceiving the true self and the deeper spiritual values of our being. So what happens then in the centering prayer, if you really let go and really rest, one begins to experience rest, the hard pan softens up, and the psyche recovers its capacity for health, which seems to be innate, and it pops out like boils pop, the weeds of a lifetime, the emotional junk, let us say, and it passes through our awareness in the form of a bombardment of thoughts, or sometimes some thoughts with heavy emotional charge to them, and sometimes even in raw emotions such as fear, panic, acute anxiety, anger, you mention it, okay. And so, to our astonishment, if this happens, we naturally say to ourselves, what's this? I thought contemplative prayer was supposed to bring repose, peace, and I never was in such a cesspool. My poor mind, my thoughts are racing, I have no control, I don't know why I'm weeping, I don't know why I'm laughing, I don't know why I'm shaking, and so on. It isn't usually as powerful as that, because if one practices this regularly on a day-to-day basis, the purification process, which is a real dynamic and organic process, tends to clean out our interior gradually and slowly at your own pace. When you get into an intensive retreat, when you meditate 3 or 4 hours a day or longer, then the process accelerates. And as you may already have been experiencing, you get to a deeper place than you've ever been before, hence deeper rest, hence more softening up of the hard pan in the unconscious, hence the junk is released, hence it begins to rise to your awareness, to your utter dismay. And you say to yourself, there must be a better way of doing this thing. The contemplative life is not for me, and you pack your bags and go home, and goodbye, the Trappists are great, whatever. Forget it. No, 1,000 times no. You're just beginning the spiritual life, believe me. Until the unconscious starts unloading, we're just playing ring around the rosy. I mean, the real heart of the ascesis is to get rid of the stuff that's the chief obstacle to our spiritual growth, getting in touch with the true self, and being able to open to those higher messages coming from God's self-communication all the time, which we can't hear because of the noise and the din of the ego. Castaneda has a marvelous description, just a few words of what this process is. He says, I think it's Don Juan, whoever the hero is, as the chief point of the discipline, stop the interior dialogue. That's it in a nutshell. If you can stop talking to yourself, commentary on everything that happens with your emotional reaction, all of which reinforces the false self and holds it in place, then the whole process of liberation begins to take place. What we call salvation is precisely this emptying out of the junk of a lifetime. Shoveling. The first thing the Spirit does when he perceives that we're serious about our spiritual journey, and he wants us to fill us with the living waters of the gospel that Jesus promised to those who believe in him, is to clean out the bathtub. Now, the bath, like some ghettos where the garbage is supposed to listen too good, our interior tub is full of junk. We have never been able to put it in the right place, which is to get rid of it. And so it's stuck inside of us, resisting grace. It warps our vision of the presence of Christ and his action in us. So the Spirit naturally does, the first thing he does isn't to give you a crown of holiness or something. The first thing he does is to get down to the nitty-gritty work, the day-to-day task of shoveling, of cleaning house. And so he gets in, he first shovels out the junk, which with our permission, of course. If we disagree, then the process stops. And then he gets down on his hands and knees, if he has hands and knees. Of course, this is an analogy. And of course, in the Byzantine Rite, the Holy Spirit is a she. So she gets in there and starts scrubbing. Gets in there with her Lysol and starts cleaning the grits and everything. And then when the tub is shiny and all the junk is out, then turn on the water and we can jump in and enjoy the waters of eternal life. So that's the purpose. It's simple. It's not that strange. But you can't take a bath if the tub is full of junk. We cannot enjoy the Spirit while our interior is full of the residue of the emotional traumas from the moment we were conceived until now, with the ways that we tried to cope with this stuff at an age that we were emotionally vulnerable, and etc. Now, the more the damage, of course, the greater is the trauma, and the bigger the job of cleaning it out. But fortunately, because of this enormous energy that we spoke of earlier, where the mustard seed of the gospel, or the inner light in which we share in God's light, and which sort of organizes our bodies in certain ways and is probably able to dominate once we're freed up from our psychological presuppositions. The brain may be able to do all kinds of things that we're not really fully aware of yet. Just beginning to study the brain in depth in the last several generations. So the brain now can work at maximum capacity because it's not limited by the two lower brains, the reptilian and the old mammalian brain, which are all wrapped up in a certain worldview with their images that the brain tends to remember until it somewhat disidentifies with its over-identification with the physical body and with its own interior thoughts and feelings, which we identify as ourselves. It's the only self we know. So it is a little scary to think of where this is going. If we lose our false self, what will happen to us? We disintegrate. Not at all. Life begins, true life, when the illusion, and it is only an illusion, of the false self system begins to dissolve and the noise subsides into interior silence, and then we begin to plug in to the energy of divine light and love, and this changes one's whole approach, and the energy now works. This energy is meant to light up the world. And I imagine each of us could do that if we plugged into that energy. But most of us use this enormous energy capable of lighting up every city in the world to run a toy electric train. Namely, our pet little attachments and projects and sensitivities and so on. It's just pitiful how this energy is wasted. But anyway, when the whole of this junk is finally cleaned out, then the energy begins to flow, and we have succeeded in tuning, something like a tuning fork, all our faculties to the utmost sensitivity to the vibrations and the frequencies expand of the presence of God and His action in us. Theologically, St. Thomas has always taught, and before him the other fathers, this marvelous teaching of the 7 gifts of the Spirit, which are particular inspirations for different aspects of human life, in which the Spirit, if we're sensitive, lives our life, so to speak, for us, with our consent, and with a maximum amount of improvement, needless to say. So the gift of counsel is there, ready to suggest what divine love would do in every event or moment of life. The gift of understanding and wisdom penetrate the contemplative dimension of the spiritual journey, and the other's fortitude enables us to keep going in the difficult periods, of which one of the most difficult is to put up with this purification process. Now, that teaching of purification is firmly embedded in our tradition from the Desert Fathers on down, and I'm simply giving it a psychological explanation that is possible because of the development of those sciences in our times, but they greatly illuminate each other, I would say, and they really ought to get together and to fully explain the human journey, because it's even when one has the right intuition and the Spirit is telling us everything is okay, you talk to someone who's supposed to know, or whether he's a psychiatrist or a priest or a minister or a bishop or some expert or some enlightened, so-called enlightened person, some of whom are enlightened, it seems, in the wrong direction, really darkened. But anyway, there's such a thing as angels of light. They look great, but on further scrutiny, you begin to smell something wrong. Well, anyway, the divine truth, light, and love is consistent. And some people have great gifts. They also have certain limitations. And it's only the integral growth of all aspects of human life, including the moral life, that you can really get the touchstone of true holiness, of true enlightenment. It's consistent at every level with nature, with human truth, with moral truth, with intellectual truth, with spiritual truth, with divine truth. If it isn't in resonance with any one of those levels, you can begin to doubt its authenticity. That's a big program for anybody to fulfill. And as long as we're in this life, I frankly doubt if anybody will fully fulfill it. At least at this point in human evolution, everybody has clay feet. Don't be surprised if your teacher turns out to have some weakness. So do you.